So good evening, I'm Catherine from the Ridgefield Historical Society. Welcome to tonight's webinar, the 1777 Danbury Raid and the Battle of Ridgefield with Ed Hines. This program will be recorded and available on our website next week. Ed Hines, CFA, was born and raised in Wilton, Connecticut. He first became interested in the Danbury Raid as a child when he learned his neighbor's house was partially burned by the British during the raid. Ed attended Wilton High School, where he played both football and lacrosse. In 1977, he graduated from the George Washington University in Washington, D.C., with a BA in political science. He subsequently spent most of his career in financial services and is currently a financial advisor with Merrill Lynch in Westport, Connecticut. He and his wife are fascinated by history and have visited many important battlefields both here and abroad. This program is co-presented by the Ridgefield Library and generously supported by Connecticut Humanities and Fairfield County Bank. Ed will be taking questions at the end of his presentation via the Q&A function located on the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. And before we get started, Ed has asked me to give a short update on the skeletal remains that were found in Ridgefield in December of 2019. And the Historical Society recently had a conversation within the last month with the emeritus state archaeologist, Nick Bellantoni, who had recently checked in with the Yale lab. And unfortunately, they are still closed due to a number of COVID scares. So unfortunately, there's no updates right now about the testing of the skeletal remains. That said, the Historical Society's National Park Services American Battlefield Protection Program grant is currently underway. The 1777 Battle of Ridgefield is the first Revolutionary War battlefield in Connecticut to receive this funding and level of research. So the Historical Society is currently working with hired researchers, heritage consultants, who are studying all aspects of the raid on Danbury with a specific focus on the Battle of Ridgefield. The goal is to construct the most detailed battlefield narrative possible, reconstruct US and British forces and their troop arrangements throughout the day on April 27th, identify areas of potential action, assess the integrity of those sites, identify and map artifacts attributed to the battle, and obtain landholder permission for future metal detecting. So I'd like to announce that the consultants would also like to work with Ridgefield residents and others in the area to identify any artifacts that might be related to the battle. So if you are in possession of any cannonballs, lead shot, buttons, gunflint, etc., please contact the Historical Society through the following email: BOR, that's Battle of Ridgefield, BOR.grant@ridgefieldhistoricalsociety.org. And this information is also on our website under the Battle of Ridgefield. It's a drop down on the website. So the Historical Society is building a 1777 Battle of Ridgefield archive to store all the research material compiled during the course of this grant, which will be available to the public and a great benefit to future generations. So I'd like to now welcome Ed to the program and enjoy the presentation.
Catherine, thank you very much. And thank you everyone for coming tonight. It's a great crowd and I'm very excited. I wish I could see you all in person, but maybe next year we'll be able to do that again. So, you know, just to jump off of some of Catherine's comments in terms of the skeleton remains and who they were and where they came from. This is extremely exciting to all history buffs. You know, to be discovering new history potentially about the Battle of Ridgefield 245 years later is just fascinating. And so I'm following this like a lot of people with a lot of interest, and I await to see some of the results coming out of Yale and Quinnipiac and the Yukon. So that's really wonderful. So the Battle of Ridgefield, the Danbury Raid and the Battle of Ridgefield. As you can see, the dates there are April 25th through 28th of 1777. It's important, I believe, to understand the context of the war in order to get a better sense of what was going on this raid and why this raid was even occurring. So exactly 2 years earlier, in April of 1775, the British left their base in Boston to go out and raid Concord because there was a ammunition depot there. They believed that ammunition belonged to the king, and they were going to go claim it. As we all know, they went out to Concord, and on the way back, almost got massacred. If it hadn't been for reinforcements coming out of Boston, it would have been a much worse day for the British troops. But all in all, it was a bad day. And after that day in April of '75, they were pretty much holed up in Boston for the rest of their period that they stayed there. Later on in '75, in late fall, Washington asked Benedict Arnold to go to Quebec. And before I even get there, earlier in '75, actually before or right around the time of the Lexington and Concord, Benedict Arnold and Ethan Allen attacked Fort Ticonderoga in New York, and they were able to take the fort. I don't believe the British troops there knew there was a war yet, but they were able to take the fort and to take the cannon. And we'll see in a minute how important that was. In the fall of '75, Washington asked Benedict Arnold to attack Quebec, while Montreal is also going to be attacked. Benedict Arnold's trek across Maine was, a terrible, terrible march. They must not have realized how far they were going because many of the men starved, and it was not a good thing. They did attack Quebec. They were repelled on New Year's Day of '76. Benedict Arnold was wounded in his left leg, and we'll see how this affects Benedict Arnold over time. As we move into '76, Henry Knox goes to Fort Ticonderoga and gets the cannon from Fort Ticonderoga, and he drags them down along the New York border and then across Massachusetts, and he brings them to Boston. They get to Boston in early March of 1776, and they plan out very carefully how they're going to mount these cannon in one night on Dorchester Heights, and that's what they did. So on one night, they moved all the cannon up, they put in barrels to protect the cannon and so forth, and when the British woke up the next morning, they realized their position was completely compromised, that the cannon had complete control over Boston. They thought about attacking the cannon, but it didn't work out. And eventually they did a negotiation between Washington and the British. And the deal was that if Washington would let them leave town without firing on them, they would not burn Boston on their way out. So on March 17th, 1776, as we all know better today as St. Patrick's Day, the British left Boston. And this was the original reason why Boston had such a big celebration every year on March 17th. That's obviously morphed into a different celebration today. The British mostly went to Nova Scotia. Some went back to England, some went back down to the West Indies. Washington at this point, he had been in a siege around Boston. He didn't know what the British would do next. So he gambled that they would probably come to New York. So Washington moved his troops in late April into position in New York to start to strengthen the defenses around New York. And eventually he found out he was right. In late June, the Howe brothers, the Admiral Howe and General Howe, in charge of the Navy and the Army of Britain, showed up in New York. And over the next 6 weeks, about 35,000 men. Of those 35,000, about 24,000 soldiers showed up in New York. They were mostly stationed on Staten Island in the beginning. And then in early August, mid-August, many of them moved across the bay into Brooklyn. So we're setting up for the Battle of Brooklyn, also many times referred to as the Battle of Long Island. On the 27th of August, the Battle of Long Island happened. The British outflanked Washington troops, and the British pretty much did everything right that day, and Washington's troops and the Patriots did pretty much everything wrong. By the end of the day, Washington and his troops were backed up against the East River, And if the British had attacked a little bit harder and continued to press the attack on that afternoon and evening, the Revolutionary War might have ended that day. But the British didn't. The Howe brothers thought that this was all a misunderstanding, and that the Patriots and the British could work out a deal, and there was no reason for them to be having a war at this point. So the Howe brothers did not press the attack on that night. Bad weather came in, and Washington over the next day was able to escape across the East River with his army pretty much intact. Over the next few months, we have the Battle of Kips Bay in September. Later on in September, 25% of New York burnt to the ground. Nathan Hale was hung a couple of days later. We have the Battle of Harlem Heights, where the Patriots actually did outsmart the British in Harlem Heights on that afternoon, and were able to win that battle. A little while later, we have the Battle of White Plains, and eventually Washington's troops ended up in Fort Washington, which is close to where the George Washington Bridge is today. And the British attacked, and they captured half of Washington's army. The other half of Washington's army was able to make it across the Hudson into New Jersey. And there for the next month or so, Washington is just trying to avoid the British at all costs. Eventually, he ends up in Pennsylvania. And as we all know, on Christmas night, he crossed the Delaware to attack the Hessians in Trenton, New Jersey. That was very successful. And a week later, he did the same thing where there was a second Battle of Trenton, and then the next day, the Battle of Princeton. So 1776 had been pretty much of a terrible year for the Patriots. But luckily for them, they went out on a high note with the battles of Trenton and Princeton. Typically, during this period, it's hard to fight a war with a musket when it's snowing and raining, and the streets and the roads are not clear. So traditionally, armies would go into winter camp. And in the winter of 76, 77, the British were in winter camp in New York City, while the Washington and his army were mostly in Morristown, New Jersey. So as I mentioned, 25% of New York had burnt down in the previous fall. More troops were showing up to help the British, and particularly the Hessians, but the Hessians showed up with no supplies. And so the British were desperate for supplies. So during the winter of 77, they planned to attack Washington's supply depot located in Danbury, Connecticut. Now, this was just a supply depot. There weren't munitions there, but there were a lot of supplies. There were probably 2,000 tents, 5,000 pair of shoes, thousands of barrels of food stuff. And the idea for the British was they were going to go to Danbury. They heard the people in Connecticut were friendly. They were going to hire the locals to help them bring the supplies from the Danbury depot down to their ships off of the current day Westport, Connecticut. And we'll see how that worked out in a moment. So during the winter, Tryon, and this is a picture of the Danbury Terrain, and it gives you a sense of, here's Danbury here, and we have the Barlow Mountains here. And you get a sense of how high they are and how Washington thought they would protect the depot from any British attack from the south. Unless a lot of us, we live around here, we've driven up on Route 7 between here and Danbury many times. But next time you do, check out these mountains. They're almost 1,000 feet high, and they're quite gnarly and very, very rough. So that's why one of the reasons why Washington had put his supply depot there. So the British, during the winter, planned this out. William Tryon was the person in charge of the battle. He had two deputies, William Woolley Erskine and James Agnew. Now, they planned, and those two were very professional military army people, whereas Tryon was really much more of a politician that had worked his way into a military commander role. During the winter, they were working with other troops that had been on Lexington Concord that knew exactly what had gone wrong. And so they practiced and planned for this raid. Two of the things that they did that were very important is they planned for sniper attack, which, as we all know, happened quite dramatically on the way back from Concord. And it's a relatively simple military maneuver to counter snipers. If you flank your troops way out to the side and move up in a line instead of in a column, those snipers are going to disappear pretty quickly because they know that they are not safe. The second thing that they did is they wanted to make sure that they knew their way around. When they were going back from Concord to Boston, they only knew about one road to get home, okay? And once things went bad, they didn't know what else to do. So in Connecticut, during the period a little bit earlier in 75, 76, Connecticut Assembly started to prosecute anyone that would help the British. And so many of the loyalists, especially in Fairfield County, moved to Long Island, and many of them moved to Oyster Bay. While after the British took New York, many of the patriots on Long Island moved to Connecticut. And we can get into this another day, but we have the beginnings of the whaleboat wars across Long Island Sound as these neighbors moved to one side or the other, but knew exactly who their neighbors had been and where they lived. So we have a number of people in Oyster Bay, and they form militias to help the British military. And one of those militias was called the Prince of Wales Royal American Volunteers. And so Tryon decided that he was going to take 200 or 300 of these people that had grown up and knew Fairfield County like the back of their hand. He was going to take them on this raid. So on April 22nd, they set off from New York. They have bad weather in the beginning, and they eventually make it a few days later into Long Island Sound. A couple of ships go to Oyster Bay to pick up the Prince of Wales Royal American Volunteers. And on the 25th of April in the afternoon, they reach Compo Beach. Now, just to be clear, in the time of the Revolution, the W's did not exist. There was no Wilton, there was no Westport, and there was no Weston. The main cities and towns here were Norwalk and then Fairfield. And the dividing line between Norwalk and Fairfield was the Saugatuck River. So Compo Beach at this time was in the town of Fairfield. So they land on the beach at Compo Beach in the afternoon. It takes them a while to get organized, and they finally get organized and set off probably around 10 or 11 o'clock on Friday night. They first walk up South Compo Road, and they get to what is now known as Route 1, but is then called the Country Road. When they get to the Country Road, much to their surprise, all of a sudden there's a volley of shots at them. 17 men, we call them the Gallon 17, had hidden behind the stone wall and opened fire on 2,000 men. You know, not a very smart thing, but they did it anyway. They probably had a few drinks before they did this, but they took one shot and then ran like hell. Well, they wounded an officer and they wounded a couple of British soldiers. And this shocked the British. They were told that people in Connecticut were friendly. And all of a sudden, within a mile or so of leaving the beach, they're getting shot at. And they know they're now in for a hard time. So they get to Country Road, they take a right on Country Road. Eventually they get to Long Lots Road and take a left on Long Lots. They go up to Bayberry and take a left on Bayberry. And eventually they go up to Cross Highway and make it out to Black Rock Turnpike. There they take a left and head up toward Danbury. When they get to, before I do that, let me just step back and, when they get to Reading, they stop at the Episcopal Church. The men have lunch. This is about noon on Saturday. The officers dine with the elders in Reading, who were pro-British at the Episcopal Church. The interesting thing here is that if you were a member of the Episcopal Church, you were probably pro-British. If you were a member of the Congregational Church, you were probably patriot. And this got so intense in some places like Reading, where the town almost split in two, because one part of the town was very much patriot, and the other part of the town was very much loyalists. So what are the patriots doing at this point? And so this is an outline of the Connecticut militia in 1777. We can see in the lower left hand the 4th Brigade, and that is in Fairfield County. That's the outline of Fairfield County even today. The commander-in-chiefs of the commander-in-chief overall of the militia was the governor, Jonathan Trumbull. And this is the forerunner of the National Guard today. And he had 2 generals that were the major generals, Worcester and Huntington, underneath him. And Worcester controlled the western half of Connecticut, while Huntington was responsible for the eastern half. In the 4th Brigade itself, the brigadier general for the 4th Brigade was Gold Selleck Silliman. He had been a lawyer in Fairfield and became the head of the brigade. So just to be clear, in terms of militias, at this time, if you're a healthy person, a male between 16 and 60, you were going to have to join the militia and train with the militia every week. Separately from the militia, there are also continental troops. And these are troops that were generally, at this point, raised by the state, but then the command was given over to the Continental Congress, who had appointed, at this point, Washington to be in charge of all the troops. So we have militia and we have continental troops, just to be clear. So the British are in Reading, and they're learning about what's going on in the area. After lunch, they were told of about 18 patriots that lived right around the area, and they arrested them and took them as prisoners and took them back to New York. Eventually, they moved on from Reading. So Selleck Silliman, he and his men had been watching the British come up Long Island Sound and didn't know what their plan was. Eventually, the British, as we all know, landed at Compo Beach. At that point, Silliman was like, well, are they going to go attack Fairfield or are they going to go to Danbury? And so they kept an eye on those troops. And as we know, they took a left on Long Lots, and then it was clear they were going to go to Danbury. George Selleck Silliman was keeping his boss, Worcester, appraised of the situation in New Haven. But by coincidence, Benedict Arnold was also home in New Haven at that time. Just to give you a little bit more information about Arnold, Arnold had been born in 1741 in Norwich. His family was quite wealthy and quite well known, but his father was a drunk. And Arnold was very, very upset about all this. So Arnold left when he was about 10 years old, and he moved to New Haven and became an apprentice at an apothecary in New Haven. He excelled at this. He did very well at business. He was helping in charge of a lot of their shipping. They did a lot of shipping between the West Indies and the colonies. And they say that Arnold was a great sailor. And he was a great gymnast. He could really move along the riggings like most people could not. Now, Arnold had done pretty well up to this point in the war. He had been wounded once, but by all accounts, most people felt that he was one of our best generals. In January of 77, mostly for political reasons, 5 generals were promoted over Arnold. And this really made Arnold mad, okay? And like every gentleman should do, his decision was he was going to resign from the army. And he told Washington, I have to resign. People have been promoted over me for no good reason. And Washington pleaded with him, and he said, please don't resign. Would you please do me a favor? Would you go to Philadelphia and make your case directly to the Continental Congress on why you should also be promoted? And Arnold said, okay, I'll take one more chance. And so Arnold had been based up toward Rhode Island at this point. And so he came home, and he was spending a few days getting his papers and everything in order from his home in New Haven when this raid happened. So Worcester has now decided that he needs to move down toward Danbury. And he contacts Arnold, and they don't come down together, but they both move toward Danbury. And so on Friday evening, probably at about 6 o'clock, Arnold, Worcester, and Gold Selleck Silliman are at the same Episcopal church the British had been at 6 hours earlier. and they had dinner with the same people the British had lunch with, because you never know who's in charge. To some extent, everyone's a spy. Some people are double spies. They learned 100 years later about some of the spying activity of some of the people in Reading. Well, the three of them, Silliman, Worcester, and Arnold, now move up toward the Bethel area, and it's about 11 o'clock at night. And they could see from the reflection in the sky that Danbury was on fire. The British had finally gotten to Danbury after being shot at once or twice more, and realized that people in Connecticut were not going to help them. And so they realized what they needed to do was to burn the supplies. So they started to burn the supplies. And once you start burning things, especially if you're burning a lot of things, it's hard to control the fire, and they pretty much burnt Danbury down. So the Patriots realize that they're too late, and they're trying to figure out what to do next. And they're trying to determine, are the British going to go back to their ships the same way they came, up Black Rock Turnpike? Or might they go through Ridgefield to Norwalk? Or a third alternative, might they just keep heading west? Because the British had sent another fleet of ships up the Hudson River to Peekskill as a decoy, so that the Patriots would not know what their plans were. So they now had 500 militia with them. Worcester took 200 of the militia and went up right outside of Danbury on Black Rock, the way the British had entered into Danbury. Arnold withdrew to the middle area of Reading with the other 300 troops, militia, and waited for word on which way the British were going. About 3 o'clock in the morning, the British realized that Worcester is there with the troops, but they also think Arnold is with him with the troops, and they're scared to death of Arnold. And so they wake up Tryon, and he is really scared. Arnold's reputation really preceded him here. So Tryon realizes he's got to get out of town, and he causes his troops to be ready to march at first light. So at first light on Sunday morning, the British are heading west. They head through Ridgebury. They burned some homes in Ridgebury. On one of these maps, you'll see a number of names of different houses. You'll also see, if you look at this carefully, and I should say that anybody that wants a copy of this handout, if you please contact Catherine afterwards, I'll make sure she has a copy of this handout that she can send to people. But you'll see there are many taverns in Ridgebury. Ridgebury is a pretty wild place, from what everybody says. It's very much filled with outlaws and so forth. Well, the British pass through, and eventually they get to South Salem Road, and they take a left, and everyone now knows that they're going to go to Ridgefield. Arnold moves his troops from Reading to Ridgefield and sets up a defensive line at the northern end of the town, excuse me. He has some more reinforcements here, and by about 11 o'clock on that morning, Sunday morning, Arnold's got about 500 militia set up on a ridge at the northern end of town. As the British are marching toward Ridgebury and down South Salem, Worcester comes across the Barlow Mountains and does an ambush on the British line. It's extremely successful. It's the most successful attack on the British during the 4-day raid. Worcester withdraws. He marches parallel to the British for a few miles and does the same tactic again. This was a major mistake. At point 2 there on the map, the British sharpshooters go after Worcester, and eventually they do mortally wound him, and Worcester is taken off the field by his son. He's taken back to Danbury, where he dies 5 days later at the age of 66. The British continue to march toward Ridgefield. As I mentioned, Tryon is really much more of a politician than he is a general, and he realizes he's going to be going up against Benedict Arnold. He wants no part of that. So, very surprisingly, he gives up command of the British Army to his 2 underlings, Erskine and Agnew. They continue south toward Ridgefield. And here you can see Arnold's line at the northern end of Ridgefield, and the British are marching straight toward that. Eventually, they get there, and we don't know exactly, and hopefully this study that the National Park Service is funding will help us understand a lot more about the exact sequence of the battle. But we understand that the British gave a frontal attack on Arnold's line maybe 2 or 3 times, and this was unsuccessful, mostly because Arnold had a great geographic position on this ridge. It was 2,000 against 500, but he had the upper hand in terms of geography. Eventually, the British realized that they're going to have to flank Arnold, and that's what they do. So they eventually flank Arnold on the other side, and the Patriots have to fall back. At one point during this period, Arnold's horse is shot from underneath him, and the horse, he's stuck partially under the horse, and a British soldier runs over to him and says, "Sir, you are now my prisoner." And Arnold supposedly pulls out his pistol and said, "Not today," and he shoots the man. Whether that's true or not, it's still a pretty good story, so we'll go with it. Arnold and his troops fall back to the area around Keeler Tavern, and as we all know, or you may know, there's still a shell from a British cannon in the side of Keeler Tavern, which is really cool. Now, Keeler Tavern was owned by Timothy Keeler. His uncle actually lived next door to the south of Keeler. The British wanted to burn Keeler's Tavern, and the uncle was a loyalist. And he said, "Please don't burn his tavern. There's a strong north wind today, and if you burn his tavern, you're going to burn my house down also." So eventually he convinced the British not to burn down Keeler's Tavern. The British, Arnold's position is not as strong here from a geographic perspective, and 2,000 British troops made pretty short work of Arnold's troops at Keeler Tavern. So Arnold now pulls back, and most of his men fall back to the area of Old Hill in today's Westport. The British camp just south of Ridgefield on that Sunday night. Monday morning, they get up. The British know to get to their ships, they're going to have to cross 2 rivers. They're going to have to cross the Norwalk River in today's Wilton, and they're going to have to cross the Saugatuck River in today's Westport. So they start to march down Ridgefield Road or Wilton Road, depending upon where you're from, and they get toward the middle of Wilton. And the Patriots have taken control of one of the bridges across Norwalk River. But because the British have people with local knowledge, they're able to inform the British command right away that yes, the Patriots have control of that bridge over the Norwalk River, but there's another bridge a half a mile north that we can march to and cross the river at that point. And that's exactly what they did. When the Patriots realized that they had been outsmarted, they withdrew to Old Hill. The British came down what is today Route 7. They took a left on what's today 33 and then up Dudley Road to the top of Chestnut Hill. From the top of Chestnut Hill, they could pretty much see everything that was going to happen. Now remember that during this period, there were almost no trees. So if you were on top of a hill, you could see a long, long way. And the reason there weren't any trees is the inhabitants had cleared all the trees either to make farmland or for fuel for fire, to cook their food. So there were very few trees in this area. So the British are now on top of Chestnut Hill. They could see that Arnold has set his men up on what is Old Hill. And Arnold has had more reinforcements come. So Arnold now has probably 2,000 men with some cannon. So equal strength to the British. And given their position on Old Hill, there's only one bridge across the Saugatuck River, and they control the route to get to that bridge. They control that bridge. So Arnold's feeling pretty confident here. But it's white knuckle time for the British. They have to find a way to get to their ships. So they're on Chestnut Hill, and what Erskine does, at this point, Agnew has been hurt, and so Woolley Erskine is in charge of the troops solely. and he decides to do something that is quite dangerous. He decides to split his men into 3 groups. Now, this gives you a shot of where Old Hill is. This is where Arnold is set up. Here's the bridge down here, the only bridge across the Saugatuck River. Arnold breaks his troops up into 3 groups. The first group we call the decoys. The second group we call the defenders. And the third group are the supply wagons. And what he does is he sends his decoys down Wilton Road. And in an area around Poplar Plains, which is around where the Red Barn is and the Merrick Parkway today, his troops start to demonstrate as if they're going to attack Arnold's troops on Old Hill. But they stay just out of range of Arnold's cannon. And they are marching in crazy ways. Arnold and his men are like, are they drunk? What are they doing? They don't seem to be making any sense out there. Well, what they're doing is they're keeping the attention of Arnold and his troops on Old Hill, okay? And as the decoys come closer, the second group, the defenders, okay, go left and go across this ford here. So there's only one bridge, and this bridge was built about 11 years earlier. Before that, this was a ford, and this is where people would ford the Saugatuck River at low tide. At high tide, there would be too much water and you could not get across. And you would have to use the high tide ford, which is 2 miles north. Now, by this time, with the bridge, many people that weren't very familiar with the area didn't know about the high tide ford. But certainly, the Prince of Wales Royal American Volunteers were very aware of the ford here. And they told Erskine, you can cross troops easily at this ford. And the key thing about a ford, the water obviously has to be relatively shallow, but importantly, the bottom has to be hard because you don't want your horses and your wagons to get stuck in the middle of the river. So as the decoys are, keeping the attention of Arnold and his troops on Old Hill, the defenders are able to cross the ford and they make a beeline for the bridge. And they take the bridge from the other side without any opposition. There's nobody guarding the bridge. And at this point, the wagons follow, they go across the ford. And after the decoys know that the other 2 groups are across the ford, they swing off the field at Poplar Plains and they heel left and they make a run for the ford. The defenders, as I said, are now at the bridge. The wagons and supplies are making their way as quickly as possible to Compo Beach. And they now have the decoys right behind them doing the same thing. Arnold at this point realizes that he's been outsmarted, outwitted, as one of the books says. And he is mad. He's really mad. And he takes a bunch of his men. It's like, let's go. We're going to go to the bridge and we're going to take that bridge. And they go down to the bridge. And Arnold's starting to run across the bridge with his men behind him and realizes that his men are not following him. They're militia. They're not trained soldiers. They're not going to attack a line of redcoats, okay? And Arnold realizes that he can't attack them alone and has to retreat. And they say his words for the militia that day were quite colorful, as we can say. Finally, the defenders on the bridge, after the other 2 groups have gotten past them, they leave the bridge and they move toward Compo, fighting a rear guard action as they move toward Compo Beach. So here we see the British secure the bridge at about 12:05. The Patriots attack the British on the bridge unsuccessfully, and then the British release the bridge probably at about 1 o'clock, and they move toward Compo Beach. Arnold follows them and tries to attack them without any success. Now, the British commander of the fleet was Duncan. And Duncan realized, obviously, he had been told that things were not going very well and that the British were low on ammunition and that the men were pretty tired and ragged. So what he did at this point is he took all of the Marines off of his ships and he set them up on top of Compo Hill. So now the British had fresh troops with ammunition on Compo Hill. Arnold and his troops tried to attack them on Compo Hill a few times, but the British, it was no match for the British at this point. The British gave a number of bayonet charges. The British at this time most of the soldiers would rather fight with their bayonet than with bullets, and they made very quick work of Arnold's men, and they had to retreat. Eventually, the British were all able to get onto their ships, and by about 9 o'clock on that Monday night, they were able to leave the area and sail back to New York City. So that is the end of the raid. So, was the raid successful? Well, the British weren't able to bring the supplies back, so on that level they weren't. But they were able to destroy Washington's supplies, and we think that it didn't have a major effect on Washington's army the next year, but it did have some consequences for the Continental Army during the rest of '77. The British need to get a lot of kudos for the fact that they were able to outwit Arnold because they had brought local people with them. And so they have to be given really high marks for being able to get out of a very tough situation because they had planned for that earlier. The British, because of this, they never lost sight of their ships again. They would never go inland enough in New England or in the North to lose sight of their ships because of what happened at Concord and then eventually what happened at Danbury. They realized it was too dangerous, and a lot of the people in the colonies hated them a lot more than they had expected. Arnold came out of this looking really, really pretty. It wasn't clear in the beginning. It wasn't clear until really 25 years ago how Arnold was outwitted by the ford, and that's how the British were able to get to their ships. But in the next couple of weeks, everybody was very pleased with Arnold. And so by the time Arnold did get to Philadelphia, he was promoted by the Continental Congress. This caused him, he did not get seniority back, but he did stay in the army. This was very important for the Patriots because, as we all know, the following fall, we have the battles of Saratoga. And at these battles, Arnold did very well. And the fact that we were able to defeat the British at Saratoga was the reason that the French decided to come into the war on the side of the Patriots. And as most people would say, that was really the linchpin to winning the war for the Patriots, of the French coming in. We don't know how many people were hurt. We think that maybe 50 British soldiers were killed, but we really don't know. Our guess is on the Patriot side is maybe more like 25 or 30 soldiers that were killed. But we do know that, especially in places like Ridgefield, 100 years later, people were putting up monuments and plaques. And one of the plaques near the battle line in Ridgefield said, "The British came as our enemies, and 18 of them stayed as our guests." A little bit of New England humor there. And so I would love to take some questions. Thank you very much for everybody paying attention. I hope you've enjoyed it. And the question and answer period is always a lot of fun, and a lot of more information will be coming out. So I think Catherine's going to come back on, and she's going to handle the question and answer period.
Yes, thank you, Ed. That was fascinating. And we do have some questions in the queue. Someone is very happy that we are recording, so that's great. This presentation will be on our website no later than next Thursday. So you can look forward to that. And then question, how much area did the 2,000 plus British troops cover on the camping in Ridgefield?
Yes, and so we've heard this question before, and I've tried to do a little research into finding out, and we don't really have a good feeling for that in terms of how much space it would have taken up, and hopefully with this survey that we're doing, we'll be able to get more information. But in just trying to, think about it and think about 2,000 troops, how much room they take up and so forth, I would think that 2,000 troops, if they're only going to be camping for one night, could pretty easily fit inside of a a football field. So that would be my guesstimate for how much room they would need to camp. And if anybody has a better understanding of how much room, please speak up.
So just noticing someone is having some issues with the audio, but again, this is recorded and will be available on our website next week. So you can certainly listen to it in its entirety next week. Another question, I actually had an ancestor in that loyalist unit, the Prince of Wales Regiment, had no idea they were involved.
Great. And along those lines, there's the militias in general that were supporting the British troops were called the Associated Loyalists. And Benjamin Franklin's son was actually in charge of the Associated Loyalists. So they were on different sides during the war and never spoke again. But the Associated Loyalists actually have a really, really good website today that has a lot of information about the Royal American Volunteers and the other groups. And there's a lot of good writing and research on that website.
Great. So Gail has a question. If the British went to Danbury to get supplies, which they were low on, why would they burn those supplies?
Because they thought they had been told people in Connecticut were friendly and that they would be able to hire them to help them bring the supplies back with their wagons from Danbury down to Compo. They didn't realize that people in Connecticut had shifted over this period and had become much more agitated and much more patriotic. And just to give you an example of that, in 1775, there was a vote in Ridgefield about whether Ridgefield should become a patriot area and oppose the crown. And the people in Ridgefield voted to stay loyalist. So even as late as 75, in a place like Ridgefield, people were friendly toward the British and thought that they should stay with the crown. So the change in Connecticut was actually quite swift. And probably a lot of it was due to Jonathan Trumbull, as he pushed for more stringent laws against people that were helping the British.
So we have a comment here. I just love Ed. So there you go, Ed. Thumbs up. And this person requested a handout, so we'll get that to you. And we had another comment. Love your maps. So another great comment. Question.
So these are the map credits. And so there's one book by Damon Douglas, and both these books were published in 2002, and both of them have a lot of new information about the raid, in particular Douglas's book. Damon Douglas discovered this map, okay, of Robertson's route. He was the engineer that did this map for the British. And before this map was discovered, no one knew really which way the British went or how they got back to their ships. But this map was discovered. It was just by mistake, like a lot of research. They found a reference to this map in the Yale Library in the 90s when they were doing research. And it was a way that we were able to finally come up with a plan of which way the British went. And so again, it's just very interesting for a history buff like myself and for everybody else probably on this call, that we continue to discover history and learn more about exactly what happened over time.
So we have another question. Were there other sniper actions on the route?
Great question. I believe there were. We don't really have, afterwards, everybody's going to say they shot at the British. So we're really not sure. But we believe that there were other small skirmishes or snipers that did shoot at the British as they marched up. But again, the weather was pretty lousy. So it would have been hard to shoot. And it would be hard to get, enough men together to make much of a difference against 2,000 troops.
What was the route Arnold took from Reading to Ridgefield?
I don't know. I don't know. Thank you.
Okay.
This is why I'm going to find out later.
Okay, to be continued. So Ricky comments, there is a plaque on North Salem Road stating it was the site where Worcester was shot. Our house is right near that. Can you tell us more about it?
So, so as I mentioned, there's 3 plaques on the road. The first plaque indicates where Worcester initially attacked the British column. The second plaque near your house is where he did his second attack, and as we all know, the sharpshooters were able to wound him. I understand that where that plaque is pretty close to the spot where Worcester was wounded. But Worcester was then taken off the field by his son and brought back to Ridgefield.
Great. Here's a question about Sybil Ludington. Can you discuss Sybil Ludington's contribution to the raid on Danbury?
Sure, be happy to. So Sybil Ludington was 16-year-old at the time. Her father, Colonel David Ludington, was in charge of the militia in Putnam County, and they heard about the raid, and obviously they wanted to come over and help protect Danbury and fight the British. The story goes that Colonel wanted to stay at his farm so he could direct the men as they came to go to Ridgefield and what to do to go to Danbury and what to do when they got there. And so Sybil volunteered that she would do a ride of approximately 40 miles to alert all of the militia to come to answer the call to come fight the British in Danbury. So there's a lot of discussion about Sybil. We do know that Sybil was a real person, but we also know that none of this story was discussed for at least 100 years. And during the 1870s, during the first centennial, a lot of stories came out about the Revolutionary War, and a lot of them were, partially made up. There's a book out there called Call to Arms. I don't have the author right in front of me right now, but this came out in 2015, I think, 2016. And this gentleman makes a very, very strong argument that Sybil Ludington's story is not true. And I tend to agree with him. And one of the reasons that one of his, I think, strongest points of why this story wasn't true is that Colonel Ludington would have had to call his troops up often. This wasn't the first time or the last time that he needed to call up his militia. And he must have had some sort of organized way to transmit that information that he wanted his men to come fight with him somewhere. And so, Sybil Ludington doing this once and never again, and needing to do it even once is a little bit of a stretch. If we had more contemporaneous, verification of the story, it might, be a little bit stronger. But I said really wasn't talked about until the centennial in the 1780s. We can't find any hard evidence of it being talked about, I think, until the 1880s. And so, while it's disappointing to a lot of people, I would discount the story. I know.
Aww.
In front of the Danbury Library, and then she's got a very large statue up in Carmel, which is, I wouldn't call it a very nice statue, but it's very big. So.
Thank you. So were the British troops harassed in any way along Danbury Road before turning south at Ridgebury?
No. And this was still early in the morning. So they're marching along George Washington Highway. We called it that after 1781. But they're getting to Ridgebury pretty early. They're probably getting to Ridgebury by 8 o'clock in the morning. And it's Sunday morning, so most of Ridgebury is sleeping.
Was there any Native American involvement or participation in the battle?
Not that we know of, no. And just on a related point, the British did not bring any Hessian troops. And the reason they didn't bring any Hessian troops is they thought this was going to be a friendly raid, and they knew the Hessians were nasty and would screw things up. So they purposely didn't bring any Hessians on this raid. But as we all know now, the people in Connecticut were not as friendly as they could have been. One thing I'll point out, this is from Davis's book, Keith Jones's book, and on Main Street, he has outlined these dwellings, and he's basically saying that any open circle is a Tory, and any closed square is a patriot. And one of the interesting things about this is that Connecticut, we know we're the Constitution state because it says it on our license plate, but we became the Constitution state in the 1630s, okay? And we were the only colony that was started without a royal charter. So we were started as a democracy right away. And so the fact that people would be living next to each other with different opinions should not be surprising. But in the rest of the colonies, this would have been very surprising because most of the colonies were very homogeneous around a particular religion and so forth. But Connecticut was not that way. And so the fact that they were still debating what way to go in 1775 shouldn't surprise any of us.
How important was Barlow Mountain and the Ridgefield topography in protecting Danbury and Washington's military supplies?
I think Washington thought it would be a lot more effective than it was. As we saw, what the British did is, they just marched up. Sorry about that. Here we go. They just marched up around the hills. They went over Hoyt's Hill, but that was the only hill they had to go over. Once they were over Hoyt's Hill, they were basically in Danbury. So effectively, the mountains didn't do anything.
So Greg's question is, were there reprisals against loyalists in Ridgefield after the raid?
No, I don't believe there were. Many of the loyalists by this point in early 77 had left Connecticut. Because in 76, the most recent law passed by the General Assembly made helping the British or working with them at all punishable by death. So many of the loyalists had left by this point.
What part of Danbury was the supply depot?
It was actually, my understanding is, and again, we don't know exactly, but my understanding is that it was spread out in a number of buildings. It wasn't one building. And it would be hard to have one building hold 2,000 tents and 5,000 pair of shoes and 4,000 barrels of foodstuff. So it was spread out throughout Danbury. Now, there were probably about 50 to 100 Continental troops that were in charge of protecting the depot. And when they heard that the British were coming, they moved as much of the medicines and smaller types of supplies into the woods and tried to hide them from the British. But those Continental troops left the area before the British got there.
What was the name of the Prince of Wales Loyalist Division's name? I know he was new in the position, but forgot his name.
And I'm glad I wrote this down before. Mumford Brown. And he was a like a lot of people at this point. He didn't have any right to be the commander, but he was a good talker and was able to become the commander of the Prince of Wales.
So someone writes, I'm not familiar with Ridgefield. Is the area where the skirmishes took place built up? Will it be difficult to visualize the battle due to development?
Great question. So yeah, it's built up to some extent. The town is actually it's one of the prettiest towns around here. Okay, it's really, really, really beautiful town. But because of that, there are a lot of houses. The large houses are set back from the road. So it's one of the few towns where we do have a battle, but we're still able to visualize very easily what the terrain looked like. So for instance, you can walk up, it's part of a condominium property, but I've never had any problem with walking up to the ridge where Arnold had set up his defense and standing there and getting a really good feeling for how the battle was going, where he set it up and how it would have worked from then. And we believe Catherine, you probably know exactly where those bodies were found, but my understanding is that the four skeletons were found near this original engagement area at the northern part of town.
Yes, and we're not at liberty to disclose the exact location.
Right.
For
good reason.
Yeah. So we got a wonderful comment. Thank you, Ed. Totally fascinating. Question: how did the British have intel that troops were moving? You mentioned movement on South Salem Road. Did they go through Pound Ridge?
No, they didn't. They came from Ridgebury, and came south out of Ridgebury, really southwest, and they would have reached South Salem Road along this area over here, and they would have taken a left at that point directly toward Ridgefield. So they didn't go into New York State at all.
Great. What did Arnold do after he had his horse shot?
Well, as I said, one of the British soldiers tried to take him prisoner, and he shot and killed him, and he was able eventually, probably pretty quickly, to free his leg and to get out of there. As I mentioned, Arnold, he was very scrappy. Today we would call him more like a gymnast. Okay, he was very agile.
So someone's, I descend from one of the named patriots who died at battle in Fairfield, David Stevens, and am following the archaeological dig. Can you show on a map where these bodies were found?
So can you repeat that once more?
So Brenda says, I descend from one of the named patriots who died at battle in Fairfield, David Stevens, and am following the archaeological dig. Can you show on a map where these bodies were found?
I cannot, I'm sorry. So just to give some context for people that might not be familiar with this. So we have the Danbury raid in 1777. 2 years later, Tryon comes back again in 1779. And the goal here is to terrorize the coast of Connecticut, to cause Washington to come out of the Highlands in New York to fight the British. So during the past year or two, Arnold has had his army spread out through the Hudson Highlands. And by being in the Highlands, it was impossible for the British to have a set-piece battle against his army. And so Washington was protecting his army by keeping them in the hills. And so the British goal was like, we're going to make it so bad along the coast of Connecticut that Washington's going to have to come out. Well, Washington didn't come out. He sent 50 troops, okay, to battle the couple of thousand that the British had. So the British started off and they attacked New Haven and burned part of New Haven. A few days later, they attacked Fairfield and destroyed Fairfield, and that's where your ancestor must have been killed. And then about a week later, they attacked Norwalk in early July and destroyed most of Norwalk. At this point, Clinton, who had taken over from the Howe brothers in charge of the British Army, now realized that Washington was not moving. And so rather than letting Tryon continue his attack, he probably would have next burnt Stamford and then Greenwich. They called off that attack because they didn't want to make everyone in Connecticut completely hate them.
Do we know? Oh, sorry.
So that person with the ancestor, you may want to contact the Fairfield Historical Museum. It's just like Ridgefield, it's another great organization. And they may have, I'm sure they have information on where some of the troops might have been buried.
Great, thank you. So do we know how many Continental troops there were in Ridgefield? Did they participate in the fighting in Westport?
We think there probably were a few. Okay, we don't want to say there were none, but our best guess is that there were maybe a 50, at tops 100 Continental troops in Ridgefield. And those troops obviously would have fallen back with Arnold to Old Hill in Westport to continue the battle, but there were very few. And some of those Continental troops, you know, there was a compound between Ridgefield and Danbury, where people would come and get their smallpox inoculations and be quarantined. And we think some of the troops that were being quarantined at that time probably did come out and fight with Arnold.
Great, thank you. Were there Patriot troops in Danbury? And if so, who was in charge?
There were never any Patriot troops in Danbury. Worcester had 200 militia with him when he was going up outside of Danbury, but I don't believe he ever entered into Danbury. He certainly didn't enter Danbury while the British were there. And then he did that pursuit across the Barlow Mountains to attack the flank of the British.
Great. Why did the British decide to go through Ridgefield instead of going the way they came?
It's not clear. We don't know.
We don't know. Okay, thank you. How long after the Battle of Ridgefield did Benedict Arnold become a traitor, and what were the circumstances surrounding his change of heart?
Great question. And again, we don't know the complete answer because he never told anybody. But we do know a number of things that happened. We know that he was wounded at Quebec. He was wounded again at Saratoga, and so he's taking really bad medicines to try to control the pain, which probably made him a little crazier. During the Patriots wintered in Philadelphia a couple of winters later, and his wife had died during the war in New Haven. So he was now a single man, and he met a young lady named Peggy Shippen. Her father was a prominent loyalist in Philadelphia, and Arnold fell head over heels for Peggy. They eventually got married. Don't want to blame it on Peggy, but she was, everybody says, a spendthrift, and Arnold was quickly in debt. So she showed him a way out. She was friends with Andre, and she arranged for Andre and Arnold to eventually have a discussion about how Arnold might be helpful to the British. Now, to be fair to Arnold, I don't want to be too fair to him, but to be a little bit fair to him, by 79, Arnold became a traitor in 1780. By 79, a lot of people that had been gung-ho in 76 were like, this war is dreadful, okay? It had destroyed the economy. The troops moving around were spreading disease. There didn't appear any end in sight. People thought Washington wasn't doing anything except sitting around and hiding. So a lot of people in the colonies got very disenchanted with the whole revolution by this point. And Arnold was one of them, and being in debt and finding a way out. So he made sure he got appointed to West Point. He was able to work on West Point and work on some of its defenses, which made it more indefensible than it had been. And then he gave the plans to the fort to Andre. Andre got caught with the plans and was eventually hung. Arnold had to make a run for it before Washington was on his tail. And so Arnold was able to get away. He actually was in the British Army, and he attacked Connecticut in 1781. He attacked near his hometown of Norwich. He attacked Groton and Groton, Connecticut, and in London. And it was a mess. They destroyed both sides of the river. The British troops obviously didn't have any respect for Arnold. He was a traitor. So Arnold he lived in Canada for a while. They eventually moved to London. Peggy petitioned the king for at least some pension, which they granted a small pension so they could have some money. But Arnold basically died broke in London in 1801. Other tidbit about that. If you ever get a chance to go to West Point and go to the chapel at West Point, on one wall there are the busts of every famous American general, and they didn't know what to do about Arnold. They didn't want to put his face on the wall, but they also realized that he's a major part of the story, and they didn't want to leave him out completely. So for Arnold's face, they put him way up in the corner. You really can't see it from the ground floor of the chapel, and it's just basically, it's just a piece of black rock where that's just carved out where his face would have been, and it's just a blank piece of stone. But it's pretty interesting to go see it.
Great. Were there signal fires to the ships at the encampment?
Well, the encampment in Ridgefield?
I presume, yes.
Yeah, I don't think so. There might have been, but it wasn't that hard to, it wasn't like the defenses were so strong that you couldn't slip people back and forth. So I'm sure that during the course of the 4 days, he was constantly updating Duncan on the ships about what was going on. Some people have argued that there might have been some fires in Westport around Tar Hill that confused the British, this, that, and the other thing. Again, I doubt it. Duncan was, throughout his career, not only at this opportunity, but throughout his career, he was a great sailor. And I don't think he would have been confused by a fire or two on land.
How would you rate the importance of the Battle of Ridgefield's success in the War of Independence?
Not very high. Okay. I would say that from my perspective, the major impact on the remainder of the war was that it allowed Arnold to stay in the Army. And as I mentioned, Arnold's participation in the battles in the fall of 77 were critical, and us winning those battles was critical to the French joining us against the British. So the battle itself was not that important from the context of the war, unless you assign a large weight to its keeping Arnold in the war, because it did keep Arnold in the war. If this had not happened, Arnold probably would not have been promoted and he would have resigned.
And to follow up with that, someone's asking, was this event a turning point of sorts for more Patriot support?
They say that people in Connecticut were very upset by this and very surprised that it happened. And so my understanding is that it did polarize the residents of Connecticut much more than they had been earlier. And they also took steps to exact revenge against the British. So I'll give you one quick story there. And so I do this in my whaleboat wars, but so about a month later, Colonel Return Meggs organizes a group in New Haven on whaleboats. They go to Guilford on the whaleboats, and from there, about 130 men cross the Sound, and they land in Southport, South Hold, on the North Fork in Long Island. They dragged their boats across the North Fork and hid during the next day. At nightfall, they rowed across the bay to the South Fork and landed about 4 miles behind Sag Harbor. They marched to Sag Harbor at the night, and about 2 o'clock in the morning, they attacked the British in Sag Harbor. They completely surprised the British. They destroyed 12 ships. They destroyed about 100 tons of foodstuff. And eventually took 90 prisoners. They took the 90 prisoners back to Connecticut. They didn't lose a man, and they returned to Connecticut 2 days later with 90 prisoners, and they had destroyed Sag Harbor, which is just another indication of how nasty this got, and it got nastier and nastier as we progress now.
We still have a plethora of questions, so we're going to probably need to. We might not get to everything since there's 30 more questions in the queue. So I'm just going to pick a few since we're at 8:16. We can go to 8:30 for sure.
If anybody comes off, in the back of my handout is my contact information. So if your questions are not answered tonight, feel free to call me or send me an email.
Thanks, Ed. Did the British set up a field hospital in Ridgefield?
Probably, well, don't know, but probably not. I mean, they would have said it. They would have commandeered someone's house for the short term to service their men. but we don't have any reports of a field hospital.
Which direction did Gold-Selleck-Silliman head after he, Worcester, and Arnold met in Reading?
So the three of them all went to Bethel, and the house they met in is still standing in Bethel. It's falling down, but it's still standing. And so he stayed with Arnold. So he pulled back with Arnold to the middle of Reading, while Worcester went up to the outskirts of Danbury.
So there's a few questions about the smallpox. Do you know exactly where the smallpox hospital was located? And can you talk a little bit more about the smallpox inoculations?
I do not know where the hospital was located. But in terms of the inoculations and in terms of the quarantines, this was a really important thing to George Washington. He was the mover and shaker behind this, making sure that men that were joining his army had to be inoculated and had to go through quarantine, because he was really afraid, for good reason, that disease like this could destroy his army. So I believe that everyone that signed up to join the Continental Army had to go through an inoculation.
When John Andre was captured, he was held in a home in South Salem. Did Arnold have much contact with Andre?
After he was captured?
Yes.
No, he didn't. So after Benedict Arnold heard that Andre was captured, his house was on the east side of the Hudson River. As we know, West Point is on the west side. And he knew that Washington was going to be coming to his house. And so he fled immediately. He had his men row him to the British warship that was stationed in the Hudson. And when they got to the British warship, he got on the British warship and ordered the 6 men that had rowed him to be arrested by the British. And so while Arnold had hoped to deliver numerous prisoners to the British and was going to get paid a certain amount per prisoner, he was only able to provide 6 prisoners to the British. And these were the men that had rowed him out to the British warship.
So we have a question. I have a friend who is related to Thaddeus Crane, who brought troops from North Salem to join the fight, and he was wounded along with Worcester. Do you know anything about Thaddeus?
I don't. I've heard his name, but I don't know.
Okay.
There are some people that, let me grab this other book, hold on.
And thanks everyone for all of your compliments. Ed, everyone's loving the presentation. I'm not reading all of the excellent presentations, but everyone's enjoying it. So,
but I mentioned this book, A Call to Arms, and it's by a gentleman named Stephen Darley. And Stephen does it was published in 2015, as I mentioned, and he does a great job at going through pension records and so forth. And so if you wanted to find out more about Thaddeus, Stephen Darley would be your man.
Great, thank you. Just writing down the names of people who are interested in the handout. Let's see. Lots of thanks. Any chance Gold-Selleck-Silliman is related by family to the well-known actor Tom Selleck?
I don't know.
Interesting question.
But if you get a chance to drive by, it's a private home. But Silliman's home in Fairfield is still standing. It's pretty cool.
So what do you think is the best book on the raid, and specifically Ridgefield?
Well, I think Call to Arms is very good. And I think that, the book by Keith Jones, Farmers Against the Crown, is also very, very good, and centers on Ridgefield quite thoroughly. So my wife is, my wife's very interested in all these topics, And my wife is actually the more of the historian than I am. So she reads all the books and I do all the talking. But when we're asked about what books are best, whether it's this battle or the Revolutionary battles in general, her advice is that you really want to buy books that are recently published, okay? Because more information, not only about the Revolutionary War, but about the Civil War and about all the wars, we continue to have more information and more knowledge of what actually happened. And as more information becomes available, especially because of the internet, our understandings of various battles and wars are evolving all the time, which is really cool.
Great. Let's see. Let's go back. There's just a couple more questions. There is a house on Route 116, what I believe is a blacksmith's house. Was this blacksmith used?
I don't know.
Okay. Was Westport similar to Reading with regards to religious partiality to either side?
So there really wasn't much in Westport. So the first establishment really of the settlement in the Westport area was Green's Farms, which was definitely a congregational type of, and I don't know if there was much of an Episcopal presence in that part of Fairfield.
Okay. So someone's asking a question about the skeletons that were found recently, and that information's on our website at ridgefieldhistoricalsociety.org. We have a whole drop down called Battle of Ridgefield, and you can read about the finding. There's a presentation on our website from Nick Bellantoni, actually 2 presentations, so you can hear about the emeritus state archaeologist who found the remains and his report on that. So you can check that out on our website. One of the maps said that there was action according to tradition. What does that mean?
I wonder where that said that. I don't know. I'm sorry, I don't know.
Okay, great.
I knew if we go long enough, we're going to get a lot of questions. I don't know.
So there's a house at the corner of George Washington Highway and Ridgebury Road where supposedly George Washington stayed. When would he have stayed there? Before the Battle of Ridgefield?
No. So Washington probably stayed there as the French and Rochambeau was marching south. So in 81, the French were in Newport and they were going to march to Virginia. And they did march to Virginia, but they wanted to stay away from the coast because they didn't want the British to know they were marching. So they headed from Newport up through Hartford, down through Ridgebury, and across the Hudson River and so forth. And when they got to Virginia is when we had the last major battle of the Revolutionary War at the Siege of Yorktown. But there's a number of plaques in the Ridgebury area about where the French troops camped overnight and so forth. And so if Washington did stay in Ridgebury, it would have been probably during that time. Excuse me, in Ridgebury.
In Ridgebury, okay, great. Sorry, just still taking down names of people who want the presentation. So someone commented, for your information, Arnold bushwhacked from Bethel to Ridgefield in an area where there were no roads at the time, may have come out near what's now Haviland Road. So I don't know if you know that answer to the question, if it was in fact Haviland Road or just a thought.
It's as good a thought as there is. I have no reason to disagree with it. When you look at a map, even today, there are no roads that easily traverse that area. So if he had to bushwhack through, that would make sense to me.
So questions about General Worcester. Where did he die? So when he was removed from the scene, where was he taken and who cared for him before he died 5 days later?
So he was taken to Danbury. I don't know what house he went to, but he was taken to Danbury by his son. His wife did make the trip over from, I believe, from New Haven. And so his wife was with him when he did pass away. So his family was with him when he passed away 5 days afterwards. And he was originally buried in Worcester Cemetery, which is a relatively small cemetery close to the center of Danbury. I believe in the 1840s, he was moved to a much larger cemetery and given a major grave. And this was done by the Masons. He was a Mason, like most people in the Continental Army. He was a Mason. And so he was given a proper burial and a proper monument. And that still stands today in Danbury. And it's quite impressive. So I'd recommend seeing it.
Great. Let's see. Lots of great presentations. Oh, so somebody referenced action according to tradition appears on page 9, right middle side of your presentation, I believe.
Thank you. Okay, it says action on this hill according to tradition. I suspect what Jones means by that is that is sort of like we believe something happened up here, but we're really not sure. And so traditionally we think something happened on this hill, but hearsay is the only thing we have on that.
Okay, great.
That's the British Field Hospital also here. And so, Jones might be right. There might have been a small hospital there.
I think we're coming to the end of the questions. And I wonder, since we're going to be posting I have a huge list of people to send the handouts to. And Ed, if you're comfortable, someone suggested that maybe when this webinar goes live on the page, we could have a PDF to the presentation so anyone could look at it. Would you be comfortable doing that?
Yeah, for sure. That'd be wonderful.
That would be a great solution. So folks, you're not going to get an email from me directly. We'll just post, when Ed sends me the presentation, it'll be posted on our website with the recording of today's program. So that's probably the most efficient, and that way it'll be available for everybody to take a look at. I think we're at the end of the questions at this point. Mostly comments. So thanks everybody for joining us, and special thanks to Ed for this extraordinary program.
Let me say one more.
Oh, sure, go ahead.
So I see that there are 109 participants still on. So Catherine and I should be very, very happy. Okay, I mean, I think we got 170 or 180, but the fact that over 100 of you have decided to listen to all the questions makes me really happy, and it shows us that you appreciated the night and are interested of this topic. I suspect that many of you are my age or around our age, and one of the things I would encourage you to do, especially if you go online to look at the presentation and so forth, is get your daughter, get your granddaughter or your grandson to watch it with you. It's a great story. It's easy to understand. Okay, and if you get a 10-year-old interested in history by telling them a great story, they're going to be interested in history forever. Okay. So I would highly encourage you to do that, because we all need to get the next generation to learn about this stuff.
Absolutely. So thank you, Ed, again. I just want to announce our next event is the Historical Society's first ever fundraiser. Old News is Good News. It's a dinner and a movie event on Sunday, May 30th. Tickets are on sale now at ridgefieldhistoricalsociety.org, and they include a 3-course dinner catered by Sarah Bousseau from here in Ridgefield, a recorded presentation of readings from the Ridgefield Press from our archives dating back to the 1870s, and a movie link good for up to 72 hours of the feature film News of the World with Tom Hanks. So I hope you join us for that event on May 30th. And again, thanks to Ed and thanks to everyone for joining us tonight, and have a wonderful rest of your evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much.